Hello everyone, how you guys doing? Hopefully you're having a wonderful day. And today we are here with a video on the state of soccer cards in 2025, a little summary on where I feel we're at. Of course, I'm just one guy with an opinion of my own. I feel like this video is good now as it's a nice regrouping point after the last, 3-5 years, depending on how long you've been around in here. It was a pretty wild ride, I would say, and I wanted to go ahead and sort of recount where I feel we're at the moment. Of course, I'd love to hear your thoughts down below in a comment, and of course, if you do like these videos, make sure to leave a like. Helps me, helps the channel. With that said, let's go ahead and talk about it. So I'll spoil it and say this is going to be a relatively, pretty optimistic video, I would say. But we are going to start with just a couple negatives, just so I can get them out of the way, just so people think that it's not all rose-colored tinted glasses and everything's grand and merry. There are some things that, at least for the moment, to me, are not the greatest. The first is one that just recently popped up. I'm not going to talk about it too much because I'm not going to have a whole lot to add, to be honest with you. But in terms of international trade, tariffs and all this type of stuff is obviously going to make that a little bit more difficult, a little more pricey as well, and it's just going to make the market a bit stickier for both people that want to flip or collectors as well. Really doesn't help any of us to a great extent, so that is a little difficult, and that is something that up until this point we really didn't have to deal with and never really thought about, I would say. But that is, at least to me, the most clear negative at the moment. There is another one, but we will talk about that now. And that's production numbers in terms of modern. I did a video quite a while ago, maybe like 4 or 5 months ago, on the total amount of numbered cards for the likes of Lamine Yamal. Best case scenario, I came up to 25,000 numbered cards. Worst case was like 50. All to say that this is just a small example of a greater thing that's going on, right? All these sets that Lamine Yamal's in, Ronaldo, Messi, a lot of the other mainstays are as well. And so all these players are having tons and tons of numbered cards, rare cards being pushed onto the market. And it's being absorbed because there's lots of people that want to gamble on these boxes, but are there that many people that want to collect these cards? We're really trying to find out where that line is. And they're not making it easy, to say the least. So modern collecting is probably as hard as ever, and at the same time, you don't really know where it's going to go. Soccer's fairly new, so a lot of this still has to work itself out. Now, while I say this is a bad thing, at the same time, I will say the proliferation of numbers is one that is kind of rough, but a lot of the reason that that's happening is because there's so many more people that are entering, and there has to be more product made, and there has to be more numbered cards because, if people are just going to get base cards, they're probably going to run out of excitement for it pretty quickly. Along with the amount of numbered cards, not only that, you have Topps and Panini both having licenses, different licenses for different leagues, for different products, and it's just really a mess. There's a lot of product being made by both manufacturers, and there's a lot of different SKUs. Back in the day, you had maybe a couple Topps releases a year. Now you're looking at definitely dozens for sure, and if you're including all the little small on-demand stuff, could be higher. So there's a lot of product in general that the hobby has to take on, but that could be, thought of as a good thing in the sense that, well, we are taking it on, for the most part, there's either growth or decay in terms of the user base in soccer, how many people are here, how many people are participating, and to see the box numbers in the print runs get cranked up every single year, while it is a little demoralizing if you're trying to collect rarer things, it is a sign that definitely a lot of people are entering. Now, are they just gambling or are they collecting too? That is an interesting topic. Definitely a lot of focus lately on gambling. You would hope that over time some of these people become collectors. Of course some of them will, just how many, that's the question. But it can be thought of as a good thing in the sense that, it's probably better than less and less boxes being made every year. Just depends on how you want to look at it. In regard to the growth that we were talking about there, you can definitely see it on social media. The vintage Discord, I'll talk about that later, but even in this example, vintage Discord, you see that growing all the time. On Instagram, back in the day, like 2021, 2022, it felt like I could just go on Instagram and I basically at least had some sort of knowledge of who almost every soccer collector was to some degree. Like if I saw someone on Instagram and I went and looked at their followers, I would know 70, 80, 90% of those people probably already be following them. It was a pretty closed community. Nowadays, I go and look at someone's Instagram followers, and I don't know, 80 to 90% of the people there. It's just grown massively and pretty organically, I would say, which is another great factor as well. A lot of this community growth has been fairly organic. Back in the day when this was growing in like 2021, it was just a lot of Americans that wanted to flip and didn't really care about soccer at all, and that was a fairly depressing time from that angle because you could kind of see through it. I mean, there was influencers out there with cameras at shows talking about Mbappe and how he was, the next best thing. Of course, great player, but when you don't know how to pronounce the prospect of that era's name and you're touting on YouTube how it's a great buy, I mean, clearly it's not very organic. So I think this has done massive good in terms of communal growth. I think affordability is also a huge factor here. I have the card ladder index here on the right. Generally, there are some things that I feel like the card ladder index doesn't do well. It misses a lot of soccer cards, but for the most part, they do have a good amount of, notable cards in there. So I do think that it is somewhat accurate. It's a little delayed because some of the cards just don't sell all that often, but generally you can see that there was a huge run in 2020 into 2021, a fall into 2022, and a pretty deep fall in 2023. And now it's sort of found its, stability point. How this plays out from here, you don't really know, but in terms of affordability, I can tell you that my collecting has gone far and beyond anything I could have ever thought back in 2021. When we were at all-time high pricing, I owned maybe a couple Messi rookies, and that was basically it. I was having to deal with the idea of, never really being able to do any sort of cool collecting in soccer, never owning any rookies of any of the greats, or at least not for a long time, and not that many. Nowadays, I would be absolutely blown away by my collection I have now if you showed it to me 4 years ago, because I would have thought there was no way. So the affordability side of it is great. If you like these cards, if you actually want these cards, this is an amazing time compared to 2021. Now, it is no 2018, 2019, trust me. I wish I was around for those times. But personally, I can settle with where we're at now, and I think that it is a nice thing to be able to buy at a huge discount compared to what some of these things were. Does that mean they're going to go back there? Does that mean that it was organic where they were at? No, but I feel pretty good buying. A big reason that may be is also knowledge. The amount of knowledge I have in soccer and the amount of knowledge I feel everyone has in soccer surely has grown over the years. If you've been around in this for a while, you'll know that your collection is constantly changing and typically getting better and better as you sort of hone in on what matters to you and why it matters to you. For example, there's gemrate.com where you can go and just look at basically all of the pop counts of all of the cards of a player, and you can get an idea for what early cards are rare. Oh, there's actually 57 Pelés. Who would have known? You never see them. How many Gazettas are there compared to record Pelés, compared to Aquarellas? There's just so many fun questions that you can ask, and when you ask those questions and find those answers, you can feel a lot better on what it is you're buying, and there's just so much information out there. Along the same lines, I mentioned the Vintage Discord before. I'll mention it again. That's just a great place to be able to go ahead and, ask questions, find out stuff, share with others, enjoy, and see what other people are collecting. It's just a great time, and definitely a huge learning resource for me. Personally, I use the search feature in that Discord whenever I want to look up names of players, sets, whatever. You can just go on a rabbit hole of just so many different things that you wouldn't necessarily be able to find online. Like, you can't look up soccer stuff, so you really have to get into the weeds. And if you get into the weeds, there's just so much there to dig through. There's also another site called Cardophilic that is, more vintage, but it has a ton of stuff, to be honest. It is absolutely loaded, a little hard to navigate, but ton of stuff there, so you can definitely learn and grow in that regard as well. And pairing that with pricing history is just huge. Once you have an understanding of how many of these things are out there, which Gemrate is actually solid now. I think back in the day, like 2020, 2021, using Gemrate and pops and all that was so hazardous because there wasn't a lot of stuff graded. Now we have like 4 or 5 years pretty solidly of things being submitted. So you don't know how much is out there, but you know generally in comparison to others how much is out there. And then you pair that up with pricing history. This Aquarella here, you can see pre-2020 it was about $500 in a PSA 2. Now it's, $1,500 to $2,000 for the most part, maybe a little above at times. And, at one point in time, it was 4 to 5. And so, you're down a lot from the highs, but of course you are. We looked at that graph earlier of the whole index, and you're up a lot from pre-boom. So it's a nice sort of middle ground to be at. if you're someone especially that's entering, I would think, but it's also even less risky. I mean, if you're spending $1,500 now compared to $5,000 a few years ago, in theory, you should have more spending power a few years later, and you can get it for a much lower price. But the pricing history is huge, and Card Ladder here is this example. They don't always have fancy graphs like this for a lot of cards. They really don't typically, but the Aquarella is a pretty big card in soccer. And being able to know what those prices were back then is absolutely massive, because when I entered, going on eBay sales history, you could only go back 3 months. You really didn't know. And so you didn't know what to compare to. You didn't know what things were like pre-boom, but now you can kind of figure that out. I guess, ultimately surmising this, you can get a really good feel for values and where things rank up within an ecosystem, whether that's a player specifically, maybe a team specifically, maybe different sets, maybe different parallels. Just the longer you're around, the more you can kind of get an idea of what everything is and where everything stands, and you could almost piece together yourself where you feel like things should fit, or at least where you think maybe things aren't fitting right, and maybe you think they should fit another way. Whatever it is, you just get a feel for it generally because you've been around, you've experienced a lot of cards, you've seen a lot of stuff. And so for me, I feel like I have as good of a feel as ever, and I think again, probably for most people, that would be the case. And so here, this really gives you an idea what happened to soccer. And so, like, state of soccer, where are we? I mean, I think this graph gives you a really good perspective on where we stand at this moment in terms of pricing, right? This is where we're at, right here. Down closer towards the lower end than the higher end, but still somewhere in the middle. And generally sort of found a bottom, maybe even grown a little bit from there. And I think for me, this is just a much more enjoyable spot to be at, when things have been, it says things have been, even, if not up a little bit over the last maybe year and a half. I feel like it's a little longer. Again, I think these indexes are a bit delayed. Over the last couple of years, at least in my experience, it's really nice to be able to know that things are generally around the same price, and you don't have to reach, and you don't have to worry, and you can just feel a little bit more certain in what it is you're buying. As you can see back here in the early days of soccer, things were generally pretty low and, moved up slow and steady. Yeah, I mean, there were little bumps here and there, but for the most part, slow and steady. And to me, that seems a lot more appealing, at least to some degree, rather than this massive roar and pretty huge fall after that. Both the up and the down, while exciting and painful, really the hobby should probably be fairly comfortable and fun all of the time, rather than, having to worry about this type of stuff. So I like the point we're at. I think that there's not as much expectations baked in. I say that generally speaking. I'm sure for like modern prospects, there's still people that are like, this guy's going to blow up at 2026 World Cup. But for the most part, I think people are relatively tame in what they're expecting at this point. One thing I don't think a lot of people think of is Pokemon growth. I think this is huge for soccer. I really, really do. I have the Card Ladder Index again here, and Pokemon is basically at its all-time high again. I mean, it's around that same point from 2021, and doesn't really show many signs of stopping. And to me, that's huge, because Pokemon is just absolutely worldwide. Soccer, obviously, also worldwide. And so if you can, translate some of those TCG Pokemon people into soccer, which I think is very doable, I think that there's a huge untapped collector base there. And I think Pokemon could be that sort of touchstone that gets them into soccer and is able to pivot them that way, or at least add that to their collection, right? I mean, for me, Pokemon cards were the first cards I had. Here I am collecting soccer. I still have some Pokemon, but soccer is my main passion, and, might not be here without Pokemon. So I think that's going to be really important for the future growth of soccer, so I wanted to throw that in here. And just generally, my future outlook on soccer is really good. I mean, it has been throughout the up, throughout the down. I've always thought really highly of soccer. In a world where I'm showing the indexes here again, there's just so many different niches within cards. And to think that if these succeed generally and soccer doesn't, that just seems so improbable to me. I mean, soccer is very clearly the sport in the world. It is the biggest sport. And, the United States alone is supporting all these different niches. I say United States alone, I'm not being wholly truthful there, of course, but something like baseball is basically fueled by U.S. collectors. Basketball a little more international, but American football, again, very, very American-based collectors. And a lot of these are head and shoulders above soccer, where there's so many different ways you can go, when I feel like for most people around the world, soccer is going to be the thing. And at least for me, I still feel that it has a great outlook going forward. But of course, that's just one man's opinion, and that's all any of this was. So do keep that in mind, of course. That's going to be it for me today in terms of the state of soccer cards from my point of view, how I'm feeling about it. Would love to hear how you're viewing things down below in a comment. If you did enjoy the video, do make sure to leave a like. I'd appreciate it greatly. And if you want to see more videos like this as soon as I go live, make sure to subscribe. But with that said, hopefully you have a wonderful day, and peace.